This is what we're making. A double shank 2-pearl ring that's soldered at one little spot on the bottom so it keeps everything in alignment. Endless possibilities for this one. Ciao. I'm using half-round ring shank that is 1.5 high, 2.5 wide. So get the inside diameter of your ring sizer using this part of your calipers. Always zero your calipers. When you get that diameter, add the height of your ring shank, 1.5, then multiply by 3.14. Cut 2 pieces, saw, file with your number 2 cut flat hand file, saw the next one. Don't try to mark them both off because you'll lose about 1/2 mil when you saw. Saw to the outside of the mark and then file back to the mark. 2 pieces, then anneal them. I'm using a 4/0 blade for this. Always make sure that your saw goes into the wood when it breaks through the metal, not your finger. File. And the way I measure is I set my calipers at whatever it's supposed to be. In this case it's 62. Hook the end of the calipers over the metal and then drag the back, and I'll have a nice fine line that I can see to saw just to the outside. So file the end that you cut with the saw, hold your 2 ring shanks together, and they need to be the same size. Now, these are work hardened because I rolled them through the rolling mill, so you need to anneal them before you can form them. I'm annealing on a charcoal block and neutral flame, but it's a fairly big flame with my Smith's mini torch. And be careful when you're using an old soldering block because you don't want solder or flux or any impurities to attach themselves to the shank. You just bring this up to a dull red. And it's annealed. Now one trick is if you put flux on this piece, and I'll zoom in. If you look at your flux, when you heat this up and your flux goes clear like that, the piece is annealed. So that's just one of the little telltale signs to look for. So quench this now and pickle it. Don't sand the ends of these after you file them. Leave that crisp edge on them. And we're going to take our flat half-round pliers, leave the end of the wire sticking out slightly. You don't want to damage the end of the wire. And we're just going to form this into an oval. And this is fairly small wire, and you can manipulate it with your fingers like a jump ring. So what we want is a perfect join lined up on the edges. Take your time, get the twist out. If you solder that with a twist in it, that means you're going to have to file it and sand it. And when you do that, you'll make the ring shank thinner, and you'll always be able to see it. So just manipulate it until you get it as close as you can. And you think, that's excellent, that's pretty close. Pretty close isn't good enough. Make it as perfect as you can. And if you look at that and you say that it's pretty close, well, once again, make it as perfect as you can. Now what we're going to do is keep this squeeze shut, and we're going to saw down through the join one time. So I keep this squeezed together, and I usually come up here on the side of the bench peg because it's easier to keep it squeezed and not saw your finger. And when you go all the way through, you should see the ring close. So now we have a perfect join, except that we have a gap the width of the saw. Yeah. So you can just take your ring bending pliers, which are these big things, go opposite the join, and just gently squeeze, and it'll close that gap. And I go to the other side just so that it's equal. So now I have a join I can live with, lined up on the sides, lined up top and bottom, ready to solder. Do both of them. Now if you have a good join, you should only need a small piece of solder. This is only 2 mil wide, 2 mil long, 0.5 wire hard solder. There are a lot of different ways that you can solder rings. You can flux your solder, flux the ring, top and bottom, and you can lay the ring right with the join on the solder. You can hold the ring in your third hand, flux the join top and bottom, and then you can perch your solder on top of this. But to do that, what you have to do is slowly go on and off the join to dry out the flux, otherwise the solder piece will jump off when you heat it up. What you could do is you could just heat your solder pick, have your solder on here, heat this join from underneath, touch your solder on top, and the solder will flow. Now this one, I'm just going to heat, and I'm just heating the join, I'm not heating the whole ring. So I'm just circling the join, and you could see that when the solder flowed, it came right up to the top of the ring. Shift it to make sure it doesn't stick. Quench and pickle. Any of those three ways is valid. Oftentimes I find pick soldering the quickest. Round up your rings on the ring mandrel with the rawhide hammer. And I usually push them down as far as I can by hand and then round them up. Flip it over, finish rounding it up, just so you don't hammer a taper into it. Check your size at this time, and these I'm making an AQ. If you've made your ring and you can't get it to fit over the mandrel, what you can do is you can hammer it sideways on your bench. It will open it up, and then you can go on your ring mandrel and round it up. If the rings are a bit wonky, like a potato chip, you can take two of your little steel bench blocks, sandwich the ring between them, give it a good smack with your rawhide hammer, and it should be nice and straight. Do them both. Hallmark it at this point. Go opposite your solder join. And the reason we're doing it now is we have a solder join to clean up with our sandpaper, and we should only need sandpaper because we have a good join and a small amount of solder. And we've got this bump, or as Clouseau would say, a bimp on this side to from the anvil on our Hallmark pliers. So tidy that up at the same time. 400 grade wet or dry paper on a sanding stick, and I just sand and follow the curve of the ring. That way I get the solder off. I don't take any unnecessary metal off. Do the sides. And the join should be pretty invisible when you finish because you've taken the time to line it up correctly. You've put just a small amount of solder on, and you've paid attention to detail. We're going to use a split mandrel on our pendant drill, and I'm holding the rings in a ring holder, appropriately named. I'm just holding it with my fingertips at the ring, because if you hold it here, you'll squeeze the ring into an oblong. And I just use a piece of paper torn off my sanding stick. It's pretty much the right size to fit on the split mandrel. You can see I'm bracing my hands together. I'm holding the handpiece fairly close to here for more control. Lovely. Do them both. Now we have two rings that are pretty close to being perfect. They could be polished up at this time and you'd have two perfect little rings. But what I want to do is solder them together just at one spot on the bottom. So I'm holding them on just edgeways on my third hand, and that will keep them lined up, and I can look to see that they're lined up. So I'm just going to put a little bit of flux right where I want to solder it, and this is a number 3 sable brush, and a fairly small piece, hard solder once again, and your normal old neutral flame, a little bit much. Heat the pick up the solder. And I'm just going to place it right where they touch. When it flows, back away. And you don't want your solder join from previous soldering there. This one's off a little bit to the side, the other one's off a bit. As long as they're not right at the spot, you'll be fine. So now we're going to quench it, pickle it, and add a little bit of detail to it. Now, if the rings aren't lined up perfectly, what you can do is you can go back on your ring mandrel Give it a bit of a tap with your rawhide hammer, and that should line them up. And then I'm just going to go opposite the solder join and stick my thumbnail in and spread these apart. You could use a burnisher. Probably a little stronger than my thumbnail. And that's all I want. Just a small spread on the top, soldered on the bottom.